Welcome to everyone watching and listening online. We're pleased that you're here with us, at least virtually. My name is Richard Moon. I am the editor of the Windsor Yearbook of Access to Justice, as well as being a member of the law faculty at the University of Windsor. Let me begin by acknowledging that the land the University of Windsor sits on is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nation, comprised of the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Now, the Windsor Yearbook of Access to Justice is committed to advancing critical scholarship and research in the areas of access to justice and social justice. The yearbook was established in 1979 as the first Canadian journal devoted to the study of access to justice and remains the foremost Canadian journal in this area. The first of the yearbook's annual distinguished lectures was delivered 40 years ago next month. We have had some remarkable speakers over the years. Past speakers have included Ursula Franklin, Gregory Baum, William Twining, Louise Arbour, John Burroughs, and many others. And we are so delighted that Dr. Ingrid Waldron has agreed to be this year's speaker. I will hand things over now to Aucha Stewart, who will tell you a little bit about the Cities and Climate Action Forum, which is co-sponsoring this event. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aucha Stewart, and I'm a second-year Windsor Law student and a member of the Cities and Climate Action Forum. The forum is a policy clinic housed at the Windsor Law Centers for Cities and is led by Windsor Law students working for academic credit. The forum has a three-part mandate: raising public awareness, capacity building amongst youth and other community builders, and direct research support for municipalities on city-level climate policy action. At its launch in 2019, the forum partnered with the Windsor International Film Festival to show the documentary There's Something in the Water, directed by actors Elliot Page and Ian Daniel, and documenting the research and advocacy on environmental racism in Nova Scotia's Indigenous and Black communities that has been the focus of Dr. Ingrid Waldron's work. Environmental racism and intersectional climate action have become increasingly important parts of the work of our clinic. We are so pleased today to be able to welcome Dr. Waldron herself to Windsor Law. I will turn the floor to Cities and Climate Action Forum Director, Dr. Aniki Smith, to introduce Dr. Waldron. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for being with us today for this event. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Waldron as well, and also to give her a brief introduction before we turn the floor over to her for her talk, which is entitled Mapping Racial Geographies of Violence on the Colonial Landscape. Dr. Waldron is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University and the Director of the NGO Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequalities, and the Community Health Project, also known as the Enrich Project. As the director of the Enrich Project over the last 8 years, Dr. Waldron has been investigating the socioeconomic, political, and health effects of environmental racism and other public infrastructure inequalities in Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities. The Enrich Project formed the basis for Dr. Waldron's first book, There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, which received the 2020 Society for Socialist Studies Errol Sharp Book Prize and the 2019 Atlantic Book Award for Scholarly Writing. As you've heard, the 2020 Netflix documentary, There's Something in the Water, is based on Dr. Waldron's book and was co-produced by Dr. Waldron, actors Elliot Page and Ian Daniel, and Julius Anderson. The Enrich Project also formed the basis for the creation of the Provincial Private Members Bill, an act to address environmental racism, Bill 111, which was introduced in the Nova Scotia Legislature on April 29th, 2015, and the Federal Private Members Bill, a national strategy to redress environmental racism, Bill C-230, which was introduced in the House of Commons on February 26, 2020, and received second reading in December 2020. It's my pleasure with that biography to turn the floor to Dr. Waldron. And I'll just note before I do so, from a housekeeping perspective, Dr. Waldron's talk will be about an hour long. We hope that you can join us for the full talk. We are recording today as well for anyone who gets knocked out or has any issues with connections. And for those who are able to stay afterwards, there will be about 10 minutes of Q&A as well. And we have the Q&A open for you to place your questions in. Welcome, Dr. Waldron.
Thank you. Okay, let me just pull this up. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me, particularly Windsor Law Center for Cities and Climate Action Forum, and Windsor Law. So what I'm going to do today is use some of the studies that I've conducted to talk about the concept of spatial violence. So I want to specifically talk about the ways in which spatial violence is manifested in urban and rural spaces using some case studies. So I'm going to explain what spatial violence is, and then I'm going to get into some of the ways in which it manifests in Nova Scotia, but other parts of Canada as well. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to provide you with an outline of how the Enrich project has been addressing specifically environmental racism over the past 9 years. But I want to begin by throwing out a few questions for you to consider as I go through my presentation this evening. So the first is, how do socially constructed ideologies about race, class, gender, and other social identities shape the constitution and perception of space? How are these ideologies spatialized in rural and urban settings? How is the spatial organization of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized bodies enabled through boundary-making practices supported by policy and law? And how do ideologies about race, class, gender, and other identities inform policies and actions on environmental racism and other place-based inequalities? So in this presentation, I use sociospatial analysis in addressing some of these questions in order to highlight the symbolic and material ways in which the complex geographies of Indigenous and Black communities have been characterized by domination, erasure, and exploitation in the spaces and places where we live, work, and play. Throughout the presentation, I use the term spatial violence to refer to the ways in which racialized peoples are harmed by state-sanctioned violence or policies, or the absence of policies, that enable environmental racism, public infrastructure inequalities, and the disproportionate impacts of climate change on racialized communities. I characterize space as a socially constructed and highly contested product and idea bound up in political, cultural, and economic meanings. But first, I just want to provide you with a definition of environmental racism. It was a question that was posed to me early on when I started my project, the Enrich project, in 2012. And yeah, I was constantly having to explain to people the definition, but I would say right now in Nova Scotia, because I've done so many talks, I guess, over the years and a lot of workshops, that I don't get asked this question anymore: what is environmental racism? So it's great that there's a level of awareness, at least in Nova Scotia, about the term or concept of environmental racism. But in 2013, I was at the beginning of the project, and I wanted to get to know community members. I wanted to get to know them on a personal level, because my project is community-based and requires, obviously, me to develop relationships with impacted communities, but also identify ways for them to help drive the research. So this is one of the communities that I drove down to in the fall of 2013. It's an African Nova Scotian community called Lincolnville, and James Desmond is a longtime activist in Lincolnville. He has been fighting the landfill there since 1974. And we filmed these workshops, and you can find out on the Enrich Project website. The name of this very short 20-minute documentary is In Whose Backyard. You can find it on YouTube as well. And we asked him how would you define environmental racism? And he said the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African, Nova Scotian, Native, and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. I love this definition because it is simple and it's succinct, right? It gets straight to the point. And it's very layered, because when you look at that definition, what you see there is disproportionality when he says that it's primarily located to certain communities. It's about race because those communities typically are racialized, although there are poor white communities that are impacted by environmental racism. So yes, it is an issue of socioeconomic status and class. We have a poor rural community in Nova Scotia called Harrietsfield that has been dealing with contaminated water since the 1980s. So it's not typical, but you do find certainly white communities, of course, those that are low income or poor, and typically in rural communities that are also trying to address issues of environmental racism. When he says that you don't have a base to fight back, he's talking about the lack of political, economic clout, or the lack of social capital in many ways. This is, of course, an issue of class. In other words, if these landfills and waste sites were placed in affluent white communities, well, they probably wouldn't be, right? But those are the communities that have the base to fight back. But because when we look at the intersections of race, socioeconomic status, social class, residents in rural and isolated communities, we have communities that in many ways are invisibilized by government. Government is slow to address their concerns. So that's really central to this definition of environmental racism, is that you select communities that you know, because of all of those things, find it much more difficult to fight back because they don't have clout in many ways. So I love that definition, but I also want to give you a more academic definition of environmental racism that comes from the father of environmental justice. His name is Dr. Robert Bullard. He's actually inspired my work. He teaches at Texas Southern University in the US, and this comes from one of his writings, but one of his first books on environmental racism is called Dumping in Dixie. So I would suggest that you look at that text. But here are the 5 main components of environmental racism. It's about, once again, disproportionality. It's about the fact that certain communities are disproportionately exposed to polluting industries and are selected, more likely to be selected for the location of these industries. So there's a greater risk, toxic burden, health risks that these communities are experiencing because they are typically selected for the location of these hazardous sites. As I mentioned earlier, or as James Desmond mentioned, it's also about the lack of political power. I would add to that economic power, the power of social class, social capital that these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters. Without a doubt, these communities speak up. You know, it's certainly in Nova Scotia, these communities have been mobilizing and speaking up for decades, but they do lack political power. So it makes it very difficult oftentimes for these communities to be heard because these communities are invisibilized. And as I mentioned earlier, that is due to race, that is due to class, but it's also because it's much easier to invisibilize communities that are in rural areas, out of the way areas, isolated areas. They tend to be forgotten. So these are forgotten communities, making it much more difficult for them to be heard. It's also about how policies are implemented. I think specifically of the environmental assessment process. Environmental assessments are a tool that, you know, it's a tool that's used to determine where, for example, a landfill gets placed, and that decision is kind of a decision that is made by government and the industry owner. So when you see the spatial patterning of industry, primarily in certain communities, it's an outcome of environmental policy. It doesn't just happen. It happens because of environmental policies, and somebody writes that policy, right? Those policies are written by human beings from a particular social class or racial grouping. So it's important to understand that it's not happenstance. It doesn't just happen. It's an outcome of environmental policy, for example, an environmental assessment. So it's the ways in which these policies allow or enable environmental racism to happen or enable the disproportionate siting of industries in certain communities. And when they do that, in many cases, they're sanctioning the harmful placement of life-threatening poisons in these communities. Next, it's about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a slow rate of cleanup typically in racialized communities because they're not heard, because they're invisibilized. So there are negative impacts of those environmental policies, but those negative impacts endure because of the slow rate of response. For example, you've got Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia, where a pulp and paper mill has been dumping effluent into Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation since 1967. But since 1967, that community has been calling on government to address the issue. And I don't know if you know, but the mill was finally closed last year. You know, after all that time, over 40 years, the community has been mobilizing, engaged in, marches and other activities and activism in order to have the government close this site. So it's only last year that happened. So when I talk about slow rate of cleanup, that's typically the case with racialized communities, and that's one of the main components of environmental racism. But another component of environmental racism is the history of excluding Indigenous and racialized communities from mainstream environmental groups, decision-making bodies, commissions, and regulatory bodies. In other words, the people who are most impacted by environmental racism, you don't get to see them around the table. So when you think of environmental NGOs, or you think of any regulatory body or decision-making body, like, for example, any Department of Environment in any province in Canada, the people sitting around the table typically don't look like the people who are most impacted. When there's a history of excluding the people who are most impacted, you don't get to hear their perspectives, their priorities, how the issues are impacting them on the ground, right? So that means that then environmental racism manifests over time. It continues to manifest. It's very difficult to address it because you're not hearing from the people who are most impacted and hearing their perspectives on how it should be addressed. So I think the intergenerational manifestation of environmental racism has a lot to do with that. We're not hearing from the people most impacted. So when we think of the definition of environmental racism, those 5 components are key. But the most important component, of course, is the first one, which is disproportionality. So if you're in a rush and somebody wants you to define environmental racism, it's certainly the first point I made at the top. Disproportionate location is the prime kind of key definition of environmental racism. I want to talk a little bit about my book and some of the arguments I've made in my book. When I started the project in 2012, I noticed a few things. I was new to this topic. If you read my book, you'll see that I talk about the environmental activists who approached me in the spring of 2012 to take on this project. Never in my life had I heard about environmental racism. At that point, there was nothing in my background that would suggest that I could take on a project like this. Yes, I am a sociologist, but I'm a sociologist of health who was focused in my PhD and my postdoctoral work on mental illness. My PhD focused on Black women's experiences with mental illness. Nothing having to do with any of this. So when he came to me and he said, I want you to take on this project on environmental racism, I looked at him and I said, I don't even know what that is, and I don't know why you selected me for this project. But as he defined it, I said to myself, well, I don't know anything about the environment, and I'm actually not that interested in the environment, but I am interested in health. And obviously this is a health issue. And I am interested in Black and Indigenous communities because I was doing some research on those communities when I was engaged in my gentrification project. So that interested me. But what also interested me was the challenge of taking on a project on a topic that I knew very little on or nothing about. So I said yes. So I was very hesitant. As I continued with the project, I realized some problems that I saw these as issues or problems in terms of how people were talking about or conceptualizing environmental racism. So in the book, what I wanted to do was kind of address the journey or focus on the journey that I took to do this project when I didn't know anything about the topic, and the mistakes and the trip ups that I made trying to do community-based research. But I also wanted to critique the environmental justice lens in Nova Scotia and Canada that I thought most academics were using, right? I had a problem with this environmental justice lens. It seemed very safe. It seemed to me that they weren't addressing the issue of racism. So I wanted to kind of refine the parameters of critique around that environmental justice lens. Why were people using environmental justice rather than environmental racism, which was kind of a term being used in the United States? What was it about Canada that was using that term? And how could I critique that term so that people get a different understanding of environmental racism? But I also wanted to look at environmental racism as a form of racial and gendered violence. In other words, what are the specific ways in which environmental racism harms, for example, Indigenous women, right? So in my book, it was about using an intersectional analysis to look at how issues of race, class, gender, etc., harm individuals on the ground. When I talk about racial and gendered violence, of course, I'm talking about the violence that comes through policy. This is not intimate partner violence, obviously, but when we use the term state-sanctioned violence or state violence, we're talking about the ways in which policies, in this case, environmental policies, harm people on the ground. But I also understood that, for example, racialized women are harmed by environmental racism in specific ways due to biology. So there's a sex component to it, but also due to the social construction of gender. And gender, of course, and sex are two different things. So I explore that in my book, particularly in the 5th chapter when I talk about health. What are the pathways through which environmental contaminants harm individuals based on gender and biology? I also want to look at the work on the racialization of space, particularly by Dr. Lipschitz, who was teaching at the University of California, because it helped to broaden my understanding of environmental racism. As I was beginning the project, I said I was really focused on environmental racism and pollutants and contaminants. And when I read Dr. Lipschitz's work, I realized that there was a whole kind of field beyond just environmental racism, that the concept of the racialization of space allowed me to go beyond environmental racism, to talk about gentrification, urban renewal, later on climate change, the various ways in which space and place-based inequalities harm communities. So I was able to then connect environmental racism to other inequalities that are happening in our places and spaces that impact racialized people in various ways. And that's how I came to an analysis that was a socio-spatial analysis of inequality. In other words, we need to connect all of these forms of inequalities in our spaces and places to environmental racism. Basically, what I figured out as I was writing the book, that everything is connected and that there's nothing wrong with talking about environmental racism. But it's connected to so many other things. And in order to understand how environmental racism manifests, you have to understand that it manifests within other inequalities that are happening simultaneously. So racialization of space is a really great concept that allows me to open up that dialogue about environment to other social processes, other inequalities that are happening. I also, as a health researcher, obviously I wanted to talk about the health impacts, but I didn't want to do it in the typical way. I wanted it to be, once again, intersectional, holistic. Certainly traditional African knowledge, traditional Indigenous knowledge, we call it Indigenous ways of knowing, two-eyed seeing, there are various terms for that, similar to African Indigenous knowledge, that there's a notion that health is holistic. We can't talk about the body without talking about the spirit, without talking about the mind, without talking about the earth, right? There's a holistic understanding of health in Black and Indigenous communities. So when I talk about health, I always want to talk about it in a holistic way. How is environmental racism impacting the body, the mind, the spirit, and the soul? And finally, I didn't want to write the book as if I was a leader on this, or that I discovered this, or that I was writing this independent. of the communities that have been mobilizing on this issue for decades in Canada and in Nova Scotia. So I wanted to document the long history of struggle, grassroots resistance, and mobilizing in Black and Indigenous communities across Canada, in Nova Scotia, around environmental racism. What were some of the struggles? What barriers did they face? And what were some of the successes and achievements? So I kind of dedicate, I mean, I do that throughout the book, but I dedicate about 2 chapters to the mobilizing, on the ground mobilizing of the communities, because I know that I do this work on their backs, right? So yeah, so that was really important to me to highlight it, but also because many of these communities, you cannot find information on these communities with respect to environmental racism in journal articles. Communities like Shelburne and Lincolnville, the 2 Black communities, very difficult to find any journal articles on these communities. So I thought it was really important to finally highlight those communities and their struggles in writing. So I want to provide a few case studies just to kind of make it real for you in terms of how environmental racism is manifesting in Nova Scotia and Canada. I just provide you with a snippet because we don't have enough time to cover all the communities across Canada. But here, the first one is Sibagin-Nagadi First Nation. This is Doreen Bernard. If you watched the film, you would have seen Doreen towards the end. She was one member of the grassroots grandmothers, and they were talking in a circle at the end with Elliot Page about the importance of water. Sibagin-Nagadi First Nation, they've been challenging a pipeline, the Alton gas project, for about 5 years. I would say 2014. A brine discharge pipeline near the Shubenacadie River. I may have some time later on, I don't know if I will, to talk about the successes for each of these communities, particularly since the film came out, which is really interesting. They've all had some achievements. So yeah, so this is a community that has been fighting the Alton gas pipeline in various ways, through activism, through marches, through petitions, through, they stood outside courthouses and the legislature in Nova Scotia. They've used their social media in very clever ways to engage the community and allies around the issue. I've loved the ways in which they have used kind of on-site organizing, on-site education, and their Treaty Truck House and Alton Gas Facebook page and social media to create awareness about this issue. So I just think it's a great model and a template for what they've done around addressing this particular issue. Here's Pictou Landing First Nation. I talked about Pictou Landing First Nation a little earlier. Since 1967, a pulp mill, Northern Pulp Mill, has been dumping effluent into Boat Harbor. And over the years, particularly around 1980, the community ramped up their resistance against this pulp mill. And over that time, there have been many broken promises by government that they would close the mill. There was a march in 2014 that was organized by Chief Andrea Paul. She's still the chief of Pictou Landing First Nation. And finally, a decision was made by then the Minister of Environment at that time that in 2020, that they're going to commit millions of dollars to the cleanup and that it will close in 2020. But over that time, there was fear that that promise would be broken once again. And once again, if you looked at the film, you'll see that Stephen McNeil kept to that promise. He decided that the environmental assessment that was done by the industry owners, the environmental assessment was not robust, and there was a frustration in his voice when he was speaking at the press conference. He said, "We've given you enough time to come back with a robust environmental assessment, and you didn't. So we're closing the mill." That announcement was made at the end of 2019, the same week as Christmas. A lot of outrage because a lot of people lost their job at the mill. It was a very difficult time for the community. They received death threats from individuals who lost their jobs, but I mean, I understand that, and the announcement was made the week of Christmas at the worst time to make such an announcement. So there's been a period there where the community received a lot of death threats and negative comments on Facebook. I think Chief Andrea Paul's daughter was threatened that she would be driven off the road. It was just, yeah, it was very tense at the time, but the mill finally closed at the end of January of last year. That's a major achievement considering that this has been happening since 1967. Amjinwang First Nation. So you're in Ontario, so I'm sure you know all about Amjinwang First Nation. This is near Sarnia, Ontario, often referred to as Chemical Valley. As you probably know, this is a community that is surrounded by about 63 petrochemical industries, and they have extremely high rates of cancer, respiratory illness, but also reproductive illnesses, reproductive anomalies, birth ratios, gendered birth ratios that are kind of out of whack. I don't have the statistics with me, but either I think male to female births is out of whack in some way. It's just really out of whack. So, I mean, people attribute that to certainly the 63 facilities surrounding the community. And they've been very active around this issue. I mean, the person that I know is Vanessa Gray. She's a young activist. I've asked her to speak at an event that I held in 2017. So yeah, so I know her, and I know that she's been mobilizing around this issue for quite some time, but I know I'm sure there are others, but she's the only one I know from that community. So that's Amjinwang First Nation. There's also Grassy Narrows First Nation near Kenora, Ontario. And they had, at that time, or still, has long been concerned about mercury contamination of the Wabigoon English River near their community. And while there was cleanup a few years ago, the community is still concerned about the health effects of mercury poisoning. So if you go online and you look up this community, well, you know, for many communities, while there is cleanup, it doesn't mean that the issue goes away. I think of Sydney and Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, where they put a park over the former toxic site, and people would say, well, yeah, but the toxins are lurking underneath. Just because you put a park over it doesn't mean the issue is addressed. So I think it's the similar issue here, that people still have concerns about mercury contamination and the health effects on the community. We're hearing a lot about Wet'suwet'en First Nation. I think this is the issue that has gotten the most attention in recent times over the past 3 years, I would say. Mass demonstrations, sit-ins, and blockades have gripped parts of Canada over the movement to support the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation, who are opposed to this multi-billion-dollar pipeline project in northern British Columbia. Africville. This is a historical African Nova Scotian communities. All African Nova Scotian communities are historical. These are communities that are very, very different than your your communities that that we see in Montreal or Toronto, Ontario. There are rural Black communities in Ontario. I certainly know that. But when we think of just in general the communities in urban spaces, you know, from various countries in Africa, from the Caribbean, or born in Canada, this is a very different community. African Nova Scotians have been in Nova Scotia for over 300 years, and they're all historical communities. There are about 53 historical African Nova Scotian communities, and 99% of them are in rural, isolated communities, which is, of course, very different from other parts of Canada, where we'll find that Black communities tend to be concentrated in urban areas. Certainly, rurality poses a lot of problems. Being Black can create barriers, being low income can create barriers, but being an isolated rural community and being an isolated rural Black community comes with many challenges. Africville experienced many of those challenges. They dealt with both urban renewal, gentrification, and environmental racism at the same time. There was an urban renewal campaign that was implemented in the mid-1960s in this community, where the community was pushed out. It's often referred to as the raising of Africville. The community was expropriated, moved into other areas, sometimes on trucks actually, Their church was burned down to make way for industrial development. But what was left were a number of social and environmental hazards when industrial development was happening. Those social and environmental hazards include a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Lincolnville, I showed you a photo of James Desmond earlier. This is his community. Lincolnville has been contending with the first and second generation landfill since 1974 and 1974 and 2006 respectively. They're very concerned because they say that increasing rates of cancer since 1974 is due to the landfill. The second generation landfill was put on top of the first generation landfill, so they are concerned that contaminated water is leaking into the second generation landfill. So they've also held marches and protests over the years to address this issue, but the landfill is still there. I think there are some cases where there's hope that environmental issues can be addressed, but I think with Lincolnville, I just don't think that this landfill is going to be moved, to be honest. So the community has kind of dealt with that in other ways, such as, testing their water so that they know what's in their water and they know how to manage it if this landfill is going to stay there. And then Shelburne, you saw Louise DeLille in the movie, in the documentary. This is Shelburne. South Shelburne is a primarily African Nova Scotian community. North Shelburne is primarily white. Shelburne has had a landfill in their community since around 1943. Extremely high rates of cancer. When I first met Louise at the end of 2015, because I wanted to hire her to do some workshops in the community. I wanted to start working in that community. And she said to me that almost everybody in her community has cancer. I thought that was stunning, but it's true. We're connected on Facebook, and it seems like often she's reaching out to me on Facebook to tell me about the fact that somebody died, this week from cancer. So it's real. But what she's done has been amazing. You saw some of that in the film, but there's more that she's done and her community has done. It's certainly a great example of how community-based research should go. So for me, in many ways, what Shelburne and the other communities have done, it's a model actually for community-based research. I also want to talk about climate change, because while environmental racism is a form of spatial violence, right? We know that if you are disproportionately locating industries in certain communities, that's a form of spatial violence, because there are spaces. Oh, just a minute. I'm doing a talk. Sorry, that's my mom. Yeah, so I would also say that climate change is an example of spatial violence. And although we are all impacted by climate change, and there are people who would argue, why is race an issue? Why do we use the term climate justice? Climate change is an outcome of the absence of policies that are addressing the disproportionate or the likelihood that Black, racialized, Indigenous communities are more likely to suffer from the structural inequities that make it difficult for them to resist and fight back and recover from climate change impacts. In other words, racialized communities are more likely to be dealing with income insecurity. They're more likely to be living in neighborhoods with poor or fragile infrastructure. These factors make it much more difficult, make them more vulnerable, first of all, if they're living in neighborhoods with fragile infrastructures, that they would not have the economic and political clout to access the resources required to build back their communities. This makes them vulnerable. It makes it difficult for them to fight back in the same way that environmental racism does. So there's some key kind of underlying factors that climate change and environmental racism share, but at the root of all that is the fact that these are communities that have long been dealing with structural inequities. At the base of it is structural inequities that result in having less power in order to address some of these issues. So when I think back to Hurricane Katrina, what we saw was a low-income African American community that was residing in hostels for months. Many of them did not have a home to go back to. They were living in communities with vulnerable, fragile infrastructure. They did not have the economic or political clout or resources to build back their communities quickly. There was a slow rate of addressing some of their issues by government. So climate change operates in a similar way to environmental racism. So when I say that it's space-based and it's a form of spatial violence, it's about where these communities are located. What resources do they have in these communities? So we need to then use a climate justice analysis. We have to understand that if certain communities are disproportionately impacted, we all are impacted, but they're impacted in very unique and specific ways because of structural inequities, then we need to make policies and develop policies that understand those intersections of race, gender, social class, income insecurity, poor quality neighborhoods, etc. Right? We can't make policies that are for everyone. We have to be very specific in the policies that we make, even in terms of gender. Right? We have a lot of scholars who are looking at climate change and gender. How do we involve more women in climate change adaptation? Because women worldwide have a unique experience of climate change. Women in developing countries, just in terms of the social construction of gender, are taking on specific roles in their communities. They're more likely to be outdoors finding resources and food for their families. So they're much more vulnerable to climate change impacts by the mere fact that they hold certain roles in their households, in their communities, making them vulnerable. So when we try to implement or incorporate a climate justice framework, it means that we are considering all of these issues, the specific ways in which people are harmed, and also the absence of issues around gender, race, and class in climate policy. I would say that public infrastructure, another form of spatial violence. I talked about Africville earlier, and I said that Africville is both an example of environmental racism and gentrification. Gentrification certainly is a place-based issue. This is the expropriation or pushing out of racialized communities to make way for condos and new buildings and new restaurants in the case of North End, Halifax. And what happens is that long-term residents who are typically low income, suffering from various inequities, are pushed out of their communities and have to find other places to go. So when we think about issues of public infrastructure, whether it be gentrification or other issues, we have to understand those issues in terms of inequities, but also in terms of health, which is something that I like to do. So we know across North American cities, then underprivileged populations and racialized peoples have less access to many factors related to public infrastructure or the built environment. So when we think of the built environment, public infrastructure, we're talking about certainly trees, green space, recreation centers, affordable transportation, whether or not you have healthy food stores in your area. Do you have access to medical clinics or health agencies that are close to your communities? These are features of the built environment and public infrastructure. They come out of planning policies, right? People make those policies. And they make those policies in many ways based on ideologies about who is worthy and who is not worthy. So what we see sometimes in communities like in the North End of Halifax is not only racial segregation in many ways, but in many of those communities, they don't have access to some of the basic resources that we take for granted. In Black communities, certainly environmental racism to me is a public infrastructure issue, but also zoning bylaws that have cut certain communities in half. We have a community here called Lucasville, a thriving Black community, a historical Black community, and zoning bylaws resulted in that community being cut in half, shrinking that community. About 5 years ago, they fought back and they actually won, so they got their community back. When we think of the built environment and we think of public infrastructure, these are health issues. We typically don't see them as health issues, but they are, because we know that exposure to greenness, to trees, to vegetation actually enhances people's health and their well-being. So it's very clear that public infrastructure planning policies are space-based issues. It has to do with where people live. So in the film, the documentary, I say your postal code determines your health. That's very true, right? Where you live is actually a social determinant of health. All the features within your neighborhood, they're all aspects of the social determinants of health. And they have great impact on people's well-being. So, you know, over the years, that is how I've come to connect these issues through a socio-spatial analysis, thanks to Dr. Lipschitz. Thanks to his concept of the racialization of space, I now see that I shouldn't really be talking about environmental racism independent of these issues. And now when I do presentations, it's very rare that I'm just going to talk about environmental racism unless the person wants me to speak just about environmental racism. I'm increasingly converging these issues because I think we need to have a much more expansive view on place-based issues, place-based harms. So what have I been doing over the years through the Enrich project to address, I might focus right now specifically on environmental racism because we don't have enough time, but I want to share with you how I've been trying to address the issue. The first thing would be creating awareness. As I mentioned to you, I got that question all the time. What is environmental racism? I've never heard of it. You know, I receive that question all the time in Nova Scotia, and I'm happy to say that I don't get that question anymore. And that's because I've done a considerable amount of public engagement events and talks. This is a central library that opened in Nova Scotia in 2014. And I saw that beautiful, it's a beautiful library. And I said to myself, I'm gonna have an event there because the library is so beautiful. And this is my favorite event. That's why I always choose this photo, because this, you know, we brought together people from different fields, of course, but, you know, I also wanted it to be celebratory. I had a Mi'kmaq Indigenous drum group. I had an African drum group. It was inspirational. It was educational. It remains my favorite event. So what we have here is Lenore Zan, MP, who introduced the federal environmental racism bill. And we have Doreen Bernard from the film, who you saw earlier, sitting down in black. And next to her, you have Caroline Wright Park from the government. And in the middle, in the blue, you have Mary Desmond, no relation to James Desmond, who you saw in the photo earlier, but she's an activist around Lincolnville. So I continue to do talks and workshops, et cetera, because I still think it's important to create awareness. There's always going to be somebody who doesn't know what environmental racism is. And of course, I'm getting asked to do talks across Canada. So while I feel that Nova Scotians are pretty much educated around environmental racism, I don't know what's really happening in the rest of Canada if people understand the concept of environmental racism. So this is something I'm going to continue to do. Of course, I wrote a book, as you know, in 2018, and this was, as I said earlier, a response to what I saw were gaps in understandings of environmental racism. For example, environmental racism versus environmental justice. I wanted to address those issues. I wanted to document the long history of struggle in the communities. I wanted to talk about the health impacts. So this came out of meetings that I had with Nova Scotia Environment, for example, when they would say to me, Ingrid, you say there's health impacts, but where's your proof? And I didn't have any proof. I didn't have any evidence because that was back in 2013. I had just started, right? So I said to myself, I'm going to write a book. And I'm going to, in that book, I'm going to provide a critique on the environmental justice lens that scholars like to use in Canada. I'm going to talk about why it's problematic. I'm going to talk about the fact that this issue needs to be centered on race. We need to be comfortable using the term environmental racism and not environmental justice. I'm going to do all the things that I guess were of concern to me in this book. I'm going to address it. That book has, yeah, I mean, it's done very well because I think it's very difficult to find a book on environmental racism that focuses on both communities. You can get a lot of books on Africville, the African Nova Scotian community. There's tons of books on that. And you can get a lot of books on the Indigenous community and environmental racism, but I haven't found, even now, any books that talks about both communities. So pick it up. Here's a mapping project. This was done by my research assistant. And of course, there was a lot of doubt, right? People were hesitant to believe what I was dishing out early on. Environmental racism, is that really real? How can the environment be racist? Was a comment that I got from someone on email. And once this map came out, a lot of the doubters were quieted in many ways because they could see it on this map, right? It's visual, obviously, and colorful. And on the map, not on this particular map, but if you go onto the website, you will see the names of all of the Indigenous communities and Black communities, and then their proximity to thermal generating stations, pulp and paper mills, landfills, etc. So it provides visual proof in many ways that these are communities that are close to landfills. You go onto the website, you will see one layer that's African Nova Scotian and one layer for the Indigenous communities. Many communities wanted something practical, right? They can't wait forever for a bill to be approved, like the environmental racism bill. And studies are great, studies are important, but how is that going to help them now? So at the event I showed you earlier, where Lenore Zan was standing up, in the audience was Fred Bonner, a geologist. And he had attended the event and he enjoyed it. And he said he wanted to meet with me. So he met with me about a few days later and he said, I loved your event, don't get me wrong. The event was great, but what tangible things are you doing for these communities? Which really upset me, right? Because I'm like, I'm a researcher and I have limitations, you know, I'm trying to develop a bill, I'm doing studies, I'm doing activist work. Like for me, when he said that, I was like a bit taken aback because I thought I'm doing so much. How dare he? But I decided not to say anything and I decided to keep my mouth shut. Thank God I did. So I said internally, I said, keep your mouth shut, Ingrid, listen to this man. And I did. And he said, I love what you're doing, Ingrid, but what are you doing? What's tangible about what you're doing? Don't you think you need to give the communities a win? I said, a win? What do you mean by a win? He said, well, why not test the water? I said, well, I can't test the water. I'm a sociologist. Like, what would I know about that? And he said, well, I'm a hydrogeologist and we can pull a team together and start testing water. That would give the community a win. It would continue to engage the communities you're working with. We could test their water. There's an immediacy about it. Go back to the community, tell them what's in their water, write a report, train them how to test their own water, which most people don't know how to do, and answer questions about the link between contaminated water and illness. And we did that. And we did a kind of sample project in Lincolnville in 2016. We did all of the things that I just mentioned, and we thought, wow, this was great, this worked. This is a model for an NGO. So in 2017, I, along with Fred and another environmental scientist, co-founded Rural Water Watch, which is testing water in rural, marginalized African Nova Scotian communities. And we now have an annual Healthy Wells Day because rural communities tend to be on well water. So we're creating awareness about the need to test your well water and to keep your wells healthy. So this is something I'm really proud of. It evolved out of the Enrich project, but it's, once again, it's tangible. It's immediate. It gives community something to hang on to while we're waiting for an environmental legislation to pass. I've also worked with EcoJustice. As you know, they have offices across Canada. They opened an office in Halifax in 2018. I immediately met with them and I said, here are some of the communities that I've been working with, and how can you help? So they've been consulting with the communities. But what's great is that the water testing projects that we've been doing, we're able to give them the results. It just works really well. You know, so they've asked us for the results of the water testing projects that we've done, and it just helps them to build their case. I'm also working with Let's Sprout. in order to embed environmental racism, environmental justice into the middle school and high school curricula. This is really important. If we're going to change the ways in which government and people in power see the issue of environmental racism, it has to start with the young people. The young people are the future leaders. They're going to hold positions in departments of environment, departments of health, et cetera, et cetera. So why not get to them? There are high schools and middle schools that are talking about sustainability, but I'm not talking about sustainability because I don't think sustainability speaks to the issue of environmental racism and colonialism and capitalism, right? So to me, courses on sustainability simply, they don't do it for me. So how can we embed the language of environmental racism into the high school curricula? We've been stopped a bit by COVID because we were meeting with communities, Indigenous communities, and getting a sense of what do they want to see in the curricula. So COVID stopped us, but we're hoping to start this up again once things settle down. I'm starting to do workshops on climate change in African Nova Scotian communities to begin with. I hired Climate Action Services in Nova Scotia to do that. We are just about to start the workshops. This is an issue, climate change, that I would say that Black people in general are not that engaged in. I hope there aren't any Black people listening that get angry with me, but I think I've been around long enough to know that it's just not an issue that engages our community. And I think it's not to blame Black people, but it's the fact that the messaging, I don't think, speaks to them. You know, you have to have messaging that tells people that this is important to you, this is important to your family, this is important to your community. And I think the climate change discourse is too scientific. It seems very gloomy and it seems very distant. This is something that's not happening now, it's happening in the future. So how can we break down the language and make it more personal? How can we get African Nova Scotian people around the table to say, this could matter to you. This is why we think this might matter to you. If we talk about the social, political, economic, health impacts of climate change, and I want to hear from you about how you think climate change will impact your community socially, economically, and health-wise, then I think you get people to talk about how climate change impacts them on a personal level. And for me, that's the way in terms of talking about climate change, not talking about greenhouse gas emissions. I realize that that's important, but that language for all of us is just not attractive and it doesn't engage people. So that's what I'm trying to do with these workshops. I train students, I mentor students in diverse disciplines. What's been thrilling to me is that the topic of environmental racism is multidisciplinary. I've had students and faculty work with me from sociology, environmental studies, planning, law, medicine, geography, political science, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been extremely exciting because I'm learning from students, I'm learning from other faculty who are in disciplines that are not my own. But it made me realize that the topic of environmental racism is so multi-sectoral and so interdisciplinary. And that the solution to environmental racism are interdisciplinary solutions. Once again, I use, media. I talked a little bit about media, but the film, but this is another way to create awareness. So I do podcasts, television, print, et cetera, et cetera. This, I have to admit, has increased since the movie came out. So it's been overwhelming. So I'm declining now. It's very tiring, but I realize that media is powerful and that in order to get the message across, and also to create empathy around the issue, if I want people to engage with the issue, that I need to get the message out, and the best way to do that is media. An example of media is certainly the documentary film with Elliot Page. So the film was shot in 2019 in April. It went to the Toronto International Film Festival and the Windsor International Film Festival, and then on Netflix at the end of March of last year. This has been very much a gift. It's great to know that the stories of the women in the film, those stories are traveling across the world because I've heard from people across the world. So yeah, I never thought anything like this would happen. I still can't really explain it, but it's been extremely exciting to have a Netflix documentary. I have to say that I first got Netflix in 2019. a friend of mine said, you should get Netflix. I was hesitant because I watch enough television, but I now realize that I've got Netflix. Now that I have Netflix, that it's so global. I don't think I realized that because I wasn't on Netflix before 2019. So it's extremely global. It's almost everywhere. And that's what you want. This is perfect knowledge mobilization, as we call it in academia. Sharing results from your book or your findings in terms of this film on a global scale. What is better than that? So that's been really exciting. And this is us on the red carpet, September 8th of 2019. All the women in the film. You've got Elliot Page kneeling, and you've got Xavier Coleman right at the back. So it's the Black man right at the back. He's the editor, Xavier. And you've got Louise and everybody. You've got Julia Sanderson, Elliot Page's personal assistant, right to the left. And the bill with Lenore Zan. The debate started last year for this national environmental racism federal bill, for the first time, introduced February of last year, went to second reading December 8th of last year. The debate will continue around March 22nd this year, when this bill will be voted on. This has been a long road for Lenore and I. We co-developed the bill, the initial version of this bill in 2015, never passed into law. We're holding out hope that finally this bill will become legislation. As you probably know, I've formed a new national anti-environmental racism coalition across Canada, organizations across Canada to address the issues in Indigenous, Black, and immigrant communities across Canada. But what we're trying to do is to come together to share resources, share expertise in order to address some of these issues. So I know that Aniki and others from at Windsor are now involved in the coalition. And finally, I'm working with Peter Wood, formerly of the Blue Dot Foundation at the David Suzuki Foundation. We're primarily focused on the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and UNDRIP and the Environmental Racism Bill. And we're just trying to kind of figure out ways to get the attention of Justin Trudeau. What can we do to get his attention about the need to address these issues through op-eds, petitions, and other actions? So we recently formed. We're getting together a group of individuals and thinking about our strategy and plan of action. So those are some of the things I've been involved in over the last few years, and I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ingrid, for that. I don't want to take much time. I'll just say that the Q&A is open, and I know there are still many on the call, and I imagine many questions that are forthcoming. So please do feel free to jump in. And just for your information, Ingrid, I'll let you know that there are representatives, or not representatives, but members of Windsor's Black community, Indigenous leaders, and other members of the community. You have Windsor Law faculty and students, you have youth climate activists, you have urban planners, you have local politicians, all on the call today. So these questions could be coming from any of them. I'll go to the first one, and please feel free to, I think we have a few minutes still, so feel free to add a couple of others if you like. The first question says, given that these communities lack the political and economic clout to make the government pay attention, do you see civil disobedience as playing a role in forcing government to act?
More and more I do. When I started the project, I thought it was all about legislation, bills, policies, and look how long that's taken. And I now feel that even if policy happens, it's because of the civil disobedience. I would say, however, that I think we need everything. There are people who think it's all about civil disobedience, and there are people who think it's all about policy. And in doing this project, I realize it's about everything. The civil disobedience brings attention like nothing else. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement and what we saw yesterday across the world and the media attention. It brings awareness to an issue. It creates a level of empathy. What we saw last year was an empathy in South Korea, of all places, around the Black Lives Matter movement. So you need that, and that needs to be sustained. But I always say that if what's happening on the ground doesn't translate into policy, not that it's meaningless, but it's not fully going to address the issues. You've got to have both. You've got to bring the attention to the issue. You've got to keep it up. It's got to be sustained. But at some point, you need to make connections to policymakers, as I have with Lenore Zan, who's been a champion, right? She's the only one really that I've really connected to on this project, but I've known her since 2015, and she continues. We are partners on this issue. So you have to find somebody who's a cheerleader, who's going to take up the issue and who's committed to translating the issue into policy. I also think that what I said earlier, and that it doesn't get any attention, but education is key. I actually think it's probably the most important thing. We have young people today who are so passionate about particularly climate change, I would say, not as much about environmental racism, but it's mostly about climate change. And the truth is they're the leaders of the future. And we can't blame the politicians necessarily. They didn't have the benefit of being educated in their school systems in a particular way around environmental racism. So they lack the knowledge. I'm not going to take them off the hook. They are adults, but they lack the knowledge and awareness about environmental racism and colonialism and how all these things intersect. So I think if we can get at the young people, provide them with a different frame, a different discourse, a different narrative in middle school and high school, or before that, then they come out with a different understanding, a different narrative, a different way of knowing. And when they become leaders, whether it be in government or in other ways, they have an understanding of the issues and how to address it. But I think they will address it differently. I know that because the young people of all races that I connect with through my Enrich project are so smart and so aware about these issues. So I really believe that they will make a different decision. So I really believe that actually even more than civil disobedience and policy is equipping young people with the intellectual tools around these issues and how to address them.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to the next question, which is from Laura Southcott, who asks, you mentioned that you have expertise in mental health studies. Have you noticed any mental health impacts in the affected communities you work in? And maybe I'll just add to, I know that's something you raised with my students when you spoke with them earlier this week about the intersection of health and environmental racism and not just sort of broad direct health effects, but the sort of bigger picture here. And I think you drew some links with COVID there as well. So interested in your comments there.
There are a few studies, not a lot, mostly in the United States. It's an interest of mine because I have a degree in psychology and I want to be able to find ways to, psychology and mental health is an interest of mine. And I know that it has an impact, even though there aren't currently studies. So it's something I want to explore. But when I think about a comment that Louise DeLille, once again, Shelburne in the film, mentioned at a press conference in 2017, I know that there's a health impact. So during a press conference when we were talking about environmental racism and other issues, she said to the press, because we live near the dump, we are considered to be the dump. We are the Black people who are the dump because we live near the dump. And that has an impact on our sense of self and our self-esteem. And recently she has been wanting me to do a study in her community about mental health issues, particularly with respect to Black men in her community. She believes that the high rates of substance dependence and depression and anxiety is due to the dump. Because I said to her, I said, well, maybe people in your community just have mental illness and substance dependence. Why do you think it's due to the dump? Because a lot of African Nova Scotian communities have high levels of mental illness. She said, Ingrid, I know it's about the dump. And I think that link needs to be highlighted. It makes sense, of course, because if you're living near a dump and you've been living, that community has been near the dump since 1943, you're perceived in a particular way by the rest of the community. And you also see yourself in a particular way. And the mobilizing that they've done over the years that has in some cases been very slow will take a toll on you mentally. So it's not really talked about. It's a taboo. I want to do that work, but there's a lot of taboo in Louise's community to talk about these issues. I understand that because Black people have tons of stigma and taboo around mental illness and talking about it and sharing it. But I know there are mental health impacts whether or not it's been documented or not.
Thank you. I know we're coming to the end, and so with your indulgence, and I have to tell you, our audience has stuck around. They want to hear every last word you have to say. So I'll just put the two last questions on the table, and they're quite different ones. One is a more technical one, and the last one I think is a great question from, I think, one of our youth participants, and a great place to conclude. So the more technical question from Mohammed Hassan is asking, I'm curious if there are companies like Danaher or Trojan Technologies with expertise in the area of water management, delivery, and purification, and why we don't harness those sorts of resources. So I'll leave that one to you, and then maybe I'll just ask you the second one at the same time, and then I'll leave you to sort of make your last comments there if I could. Katrina Banham asks, first, thank you so much for this talk and your time. What do you recommend for young activists to do to gain political attention to environmental racism in Canada? How do we highlight the intersectionalities in our efforts?
The first question, I'm not quite sure what he's asking in terms of bringing clean water. It's not something that maybe I've considered, although the Rural Water Watch, what we're doing is we are addressing water contamination. There's the other issue of bringing clean water. I know that we were involved in, I forgot the name of it, an innovative ultrafiltration technology, which was about cleaning out the water. Because I'm not an environmental scientist, I don't know all the details around it, but part of our work in another study was using this ultrafiltration technology to clean out the water. There might be a cost to what Mohammed is suggesting. Rural Water Watch, we do our work at no cost. So one of the things that we are a community-based NGO that does everything at no cost, because these are low-income rural communities. So there might be companies that can bring clean water, but do they charge? I guess I would ask, are they doing it at no cost? So we're actually filling a need, I guess, because these are communities that don't have the money to pay for our services. In terms of activism, the young people are doing it. Like, I don't think they need any advice from me. I mean, they're doing it around climate change. I wish they would do it more around environmental racism. They're interconnecting issues. Exactly what young people are doing today around, their climate marches. The one that happened in Montreal in 2019 was stunning. The school sit-ins, the sit-ins, at university president's office, like in Nova Scotia, where they just sit in the president's office for days. All of that is what you want to do. It's bringing attention to the issue. Please do that for environmental racism as well, not just climate change. But I would say that young people need to get to know the communities in their backyard who are on the front lines. That's the first thing. Get to know who they are and follow their lead. Sometimes we could take an approach that is not necessarily the approach that the communities want us to take, because we're so passionate. It's not because we're bad people, but we're passionate and we want to help and we don't know what to do. And what I try to do through my project as much as possible is to take the lead from the communities I'm working with. I've discovered in other projects that, I just went ahead and I did it. And then I realized that, the community doesn't seem that invested. Why? And I realized it's because they didn't actually create the research questions and the objectives. I never really listened to them about, do you actually want me to do this? I just thought, yeah, of course they want me to do this. And I went right ahead. So find out who the affected communities are, Indigenous or otherwise, in your backyard. Develop organic relationships with them. And one way to do that is to show up at events. I tried to build those relationships with Sabaganagati First Nation early on by showing up, even though it was 2 hours away and I don't drive, right? But I try to find my way up to their community and engage in talks and et cetera, et cetera. Get to know them, get your face known. Then you'll build trust. And then you take the lead from them. I always say it's like a dance, right? Somebody has to lead. Let them lead. They will tell you what they need from you. These communities, regardless of the fact that they're low income, living in rural areas, they know exactly what they need. They are experts in their own communities. And sometimes we think, bringing in a geologist, those are the experts. But the truth is, the communities are the experts. They know what they need. You know what they don't have? They just don't have the resources sometimes. They don't have the money, the funding. The networks of geologists, they sometimes don't know how to navigate government systems, right? So this is what we try to do with the NGO, Rural Water Watch. We bring geologists at no cost to them. They now know, like Louise's community now knows how to navigate government. I mean, she got the housing authority to donate 5 wells to the community. I don't know how Louise did that. That's not in the film, but she did that because now she knows how to navigate government systems. So I think you need to take as an activist a personal approach. Get to know the communities, find out what they want. Don't assume what they want and go ahead and do it, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for your questions. In just a second, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Professor Moon to give our thanks in conclusion. Before I do that, want to say a quick thank you, in addition to Acha Stewart, also to some of our other Cities and Climate Action students, Windsor Law students, Valerie Tan, Mikhail Daniel, Claudia Grebkowska, and Narmada Gunawardana, who have been a big part of organizing today's event. And our ongoing keynote series. So thank you again so much. And Professor Moon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Annika. Thanks for everything you've done in organizing this. So Dr. Waldron, we're really grateful for you taking the time to talk to us today and for delivering what was a really important, engaging talk. And I also want to say thanks for your work. And I think it's been really important to, we have a better idea of this idea of environmental racism thanks to your work, and we're grateful for that. I also want to just thank everybody who listened in, and I'll just finish by saying take care and keep well, one and all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.